The Center for Design and Material Culture at UW's School of Human Ecology houses a vast trove of textile objects. Often these objects are clothing, but can also include quilts, drapes, wall hangings, anything that can be made from spun cloth. The common feature among all the items in their collection is historic or artistic value and significance to scholars and students, and what each item has to teach us about gender, culture, and the human condition. A cross-section of the center's collection is on display now in an exhibit titled Afterlives, Material Stories from the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection. Monday Buzz producer Nicholas Wootton paid a visit and spoke with exhibit curator Sarah Ann Carter.
I'm here with Sarah Ann Carter at Nancy Nicholas Hall on the UW campus. Sarah, can you tell me what your role here is at the university?
I am an associate professor of design studies. I'm also the executive director of the Center for Design and Material Culture, and I happen to be the curator of the exhibition that we're standing in right now. It's called Afterlives, Material Stories from the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection.
And what comprises this collection? What is it drawn from? Is it on a specific theme, or is it a bunch of different things?
Well, the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection is a true treasure that we have here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is a remarkable collection of nearly 14,000 textiles from around the world. And the core of this collection was collected by Helen Louise Allen, who was a professor here. And over the past 50 plus years since her death, we've cared for this collection. It's continued to grow. And we've really thought about how this collection is truly a vital resource for teaching, research here at the university. And so this exhibition, Afterlives, is a way for us to think about what happens to objects when they come into a museum collection. The objects don't just come into the museum, get put away in our storage, locked away. They come out again and again, and they live exciting, vibrant, active lives as material things here at the university in service of our mission of teaching our students, of conducting research, and of connecting with our community.
And as I'm just kind of scanning the collection here in two adjacent rooms, it all looks like various types of textiles.
Yes.
And textiles are things that we wear normally. And if they have meaning in say what they say about fashions of a given era or modesty in a given era. But I sense that there's more to it that's evoked by this collection. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So they connect across campus to area studies. We can think about things like quilts and mathematics. We can think about pattern design. We can think about chemistry in terms of the materials of these objects themselves. We can think about cultural history. We can think about gender studies. We can think about all of these different things through these objects. And we have classes from all of these different fields that visit us and that engage with our objects in interesting and meaningful ways. The opening space for the Afterlives Gallery contains a number of objects that all have one thing in common. And I'd kind of invite you to look around, and what do you notice in this space?
Well, there are a lot of items of clothing and quilting, and I see butterflies in a number of different things.
You see some butterflies. Yes, it is one thing. Sorry, exactly.
Okay.
I'm so
What's
glad.
that about? Yeah.
So we have a number of butterflies in this opening space because that's become a real metaphor for this exhibit. Because it's a reminder that textiles, in the hands of thoughtful scholars and makers and students and teachers, can be transformed into all of these new possibilities. So we're thinking about the idea of metamorphosis, of transformation, of objects that can be part of futures their original makers never even imagined, right? So a really cool example of that is this amazing quilt right here. And it's a quilt that has on it a number of flowers and a number of beautiful butterflies. Part of what makes this object so beautiful is its story. This object is made out of feed sacks. So when this object was created in the early 20th century, the maker did not go to a fabric store and pick out all of these different patterns, but these patterns were on printed feed sacks.
And these feed sacks would have been at some kind of a grain store or a farmer supply store.
So if you are living on a farm, perhaps some of the bulk materials that you need for everyday life might come to you, not today, as you would imagine, in a plastic container, but in a beautiful textile bag, printed with fabric that could be reused. And so this quilt is a wonderful example of that kind of creative and beautiful reuse. So not only does it have butterflies on it, but the object itself suggests that kind of metamorphosis, that transformation from fabric used in this super utilitarian way to fabric reused, again, in a useful way. It's a quilt for your bed, but it is beautiful.
So would this be a working quilt, or is it designed as a wall hanging?
A working quilt, absolutely. But we can think about it as a work of art too. Objects, especially in the context of this sort of afterlife show, they can embody different functions at different moments in their life, right? Human beings move through time at one pace, and the objects around us move through time at different paces, right? Sometimes things are used up and are thrown away. Sometimes things outlast us by a long period of time, right? So we're all moving through the world sort of at different times, and I often think of some objects, sometimes especially precious objects like these, as time travelers, right? This is something that, survived the person who created it to inspire her granddaughter, who went on to become an amazing quilter herself. And now in our collection, continues to inspire students. We had a student last year who created her own quilt based on this object as part of a research project. So we're looking at this dress, which I think is absolutely gorgeous. And yes, it is an evening gown with a train. And it is not just gorgeous, but it is heavy. This dress is called Waiting. It weighs about 40 pounds. And this was designed by Professor Carolyn Callenborn, who recently retired from our design studies department. And she designed this dress as a way to symbolically talk about the kinds of work one does when you're, say, organizing a big event or taking on a big project. You have all these little pieces that each one might seem kind of light, but taken together, they are heavy and they weigh you down. And it can look totally gorgeous and glamorous. Like this dress has this wonderful kind of amorphous train with this really beautiful surface pattern created by these river rocks wrapped in this shiny fabric. Right? It's gorgeous, but it's heavy, right? And so, Carolyn talked about designing this sort of to symbolically represent how she felt when she was organizing like huge conferences or events. And my favorite part of this dress was something I only learned in talking to her about it before we displayed it for the show, was that if you look closely over here, what you see the zipper here down the front.
Yes.
The kind of zipper that you might have in your jacket. She said, because I wanted to imagine that you're wearing this dress, and then as soon as the event's over, you unzip it, and you can just run away. And you leave behind this heavy weighted dress. If you have a dress that weighs 40 pounds, it's going to be pretty hard to preserve this object, right? Just the weight of it is constantly pulling down at the fabric. And so, conservation and preventative conservation is one way we can do that. So if you look closely at this label, you can see this conservation box that Carolyn Jenkinson, our collections manager, has designed to allow us to more safely store this object by providing support under all of these weights. And that would allow it to be sort of lifted out of the box while still supporting this very heavy skirt. And part of what I love about my role here is we get to support a team that not only does this work, but we're training students to care for objects, to properly store objects, to learn how to mount things, to build the professional skills they need to have careers in the museum field.
This looks like I see something with the name Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yes. So this textile is another example of some of the ways in which we're able to care for objects into the future. So this is a really beautiful piece of yardage that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's design 105. And this is an example of an object that we collaborated with our friends at the Midwest Art Conservation Center to conserve this object. So just as with something like Waiting, this dress that is quite heavy and needed a special preservation context to help us carry it into the future, This object needed to be cleaned, needed to be stabilized, and that's the kind of work that we were able to help facilitate for this object so that we could continue to enjoy it and have this wonderful example of a Frank Lloyd Wright textile like this in our collection for students to study and for people to come to understand more about historic interiors.
Okay, so what is this made of? What would it have been made for? And what are the kinds of forces that would cause it to degrade over time?
So this is from the mid-1950s, and this would have been used in an interior. Possibly it could have been a drape. Could have been that kind of panel you could imagine in sort of a mid-century modern home. And this is something that could degrade for lots of reasons. Light, it's printed on linen. Light could cause it to fade, but also in the 1950s, lots of people are smoking, right? So smoking is definitely something that could make it dirtier. Just other environmental conditions, right? We don't know for sure what it was that caused it to have some of that discoloration. And so our colleagues at the Midwest Art Conservation Center were able to remove some of that staining and to help stabilize it, because there were some parts that over time it started to stretch out. And there's a repair that I can show you over here, where you can see a very thin layer of, I think it's like a muslin, very thin layer of muslin. So if you look closely to where I'm pointing, you see these large, almost like whip stitches here.
And those would have been things that people working here would have done.
This kind of work was actually done at the Midwest Art Conservation Center in Minneapolis. But we collaborated with them, and our colleague Carolyn went up there to support this work. But you can see that repair. You see that you barely can see it, and that's by design. But if you look closely, you can see it. This square here, with these zigzaggy stitches, are stabilizing these areas of damage. So because we were able to invest in this kind of work, this object is something that we can put on view and that we can have in the future.
The work stabilizing it does not draw attention to itself. You'd have to be looking for it to see it,
yes.
But you can see it if you do look for it. Is that intentional?
Yes, exactly. And so you are not supposed to see it in your appreciation of the object. You show I'm pointing out this on the back. It is not interfering with the pattern. But as with any sort of conservation work done today, you should be able to figure out what it was, and it should always be reversible. And so someone could look closely at this and say, oh, I see what they did. Maybe there's a new technique that we have now that would be better. I mean, this is pretty perfect, but there might be some new way someone wants to do it. And with conservation, you always should be able to go back and to undo it.
And would there be any thought to this serves as a document of the preservation work that was done, so that 100 years from now, people researching this can tell, oh, back in the 2024, there was this done. This is part of the life of this object, the history of this object.
Absolutely. And so in that way, it could absolutely connect to another one of those kinds of object afterlife stories. So these objects are part of another one of the categories of work that we really wanted to think about in Afterlives. And this is a section that we're calling animating research, so thinking about really bringing student research to life through the objects in our collection. So one of the really exciting afterlives for me, especially as a teacher, one of the most exciting afterlives, is seeing what the objects in our collection make possible for our students, right? And there's several objects here that reflect either students' creative work or that reflect students' research. And one object and then some images that I would like to share are the outcome of a summer research fellowship that we offer every summer through the Shipstone Foundation here in the Center for Design and Material Culture. And in this case, these two students, Gracie Harshaw and Eden Midell, were inspired by the objects in that photograph there. The object that you see there is from the textile collection, and it is a 19th century hoop skirt. And so these students, both of whom are makers in our textile fashion design program here, were inspired by this object, and they said they wanted their summer research experience to look at objects in our collection, like these hoops, and to create work in conversation with these historic objects. And these two works are what they created. This hoop garment here, where there's this large, 6-foot-tall photograph of it, is here in photograph form because it's much too big, even for our gallery. And Gracie created this object inspired by these 19th century hoops, but instead of the hoop skirt creating an hourglass figure or creating a very particular aesthetic, she wanted an object that would almost like refuse your gaze, something that wouldn't allow you not to see the wearer's body.
It looks like a bunch of strands of cloth in kind of a grid pattern that are kind of egg-shaped, sort of, and you can see a dressmaking form that is roughly the size of a woman's torso, going down to from the shoulders to about the knees, and that's only about a third of the height of this object.
Yeah, it's huge, and I loved talking with her about it and hearing her talk about her work. And just to read a quote that she shared, she said, "I wanted to lean into the concept of taking up space," and she wanted to see how this garment could help one imagine what it meant to really take up space in this way. And as she continued, just as she described, to sort of refuse the male gaze and to say, what does it mean to use the hoop that in the 19th century we might think of as part of a very particular kind of femininity, instead to say, I'm going to take up space and I'm going to use this same kind of structural form to do something very different as part of her creative practice. And then Eden similarly played with the idea of the hoop within this very really, I think, so creative garment, which she's calling, hooded corset and tube pants. And you can see we have hoops stitched into the legs and into the arms.
It looks like a 1950s science fiction movie. What is she trying to say with this?
I think she's experimenting with what the hoop can do structurally. Eden writes, fashion is a multisensory experience. Again, it takes up space. They're thinking of how the hoop could help one understand the space that we might want to actually hold with our bodies and our garments. And so Eden's really experimenting with some of those ideas about how do we interact with our garments and with the space that we inhabit. And both of them are really thinking about those ideas, and they're such creative ways. I often think historically in my work, and so I could imagine one of my students writing a research paper on a hoop like these. But these two students really said, well, what can we create? How does this become a prompt for my thinking in a new way, which is exciting.
I wanted to ask you about something that looks like a genuine camisole from the early part of the 20th century. And I see these beautifully embroidered butterflies on it. Yes. One on each, about halfway between the breast and the armpit, and then one at the very center. Next to it is a modern equivalent of a camisole, but it has some very interesting embroidery in it. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So this camisole is this early 20th century camisole, and of course it has butterflies on it, so very excited to include it. But this object was a point of inspiration for another student here, in this case a graduate student, Noah Rickey, who was interested in researching some of these historic undergarments and thinking about what might be some 21st century versions of those garments. And in this case, creating a garment in conversation with this camisole that would be considered like a binder cover is how they have described it. So a garment worn by a trans person as a kind of undergarment.
The description says that these embroideries here represent the scars from a breast or a mastectomy that would be part of a transition process, and that the binder cover, it's covering the bindings of the result of that surgery. Am I correct on that?
Yes, exactly. And so the way Noah describes it, they wrote, what did transmasculine people wear as undergarments during the Edwardian era? And that was really a question that prompted them to create this garment. So thinking historically, thinking about how an historic object like this might inspire contemporary work, could address questions that connect to identity and that connect to their own practice as an artist and maker.
So it makes me wonder, what kinds of choices would someone who was trans but had no real way of expressing it publicly, what kinds of choices would they have made in their own clothing? How could they have accommodated their own needs? in their clothing choices. I mean, does this camisole perhaps represent that kind of choice?
I think it's often difficult to talk about ideas about identity historically because language and the ways that we might define or talk about identity has changed a lot over time, right? But whenever we're looking at an object, particularly an object like this one that is such like a beautiful and everyday kind of thing, those kinds of questions invite us to reflect on the fact that we don't necessarily know about the inner life of the person who wore it. There are things that we know about people in the past, and there are things that we can't know or don't know. And that is a space in which artists can often do really interesting work, right? That's a space in which historians can sometimes do that work through documentary research and through material culture research and analysis. But artists can also engage in some of that imaginative storytelling. And I think this pairing, this inspiration object and then work that Noah created, suggests some of the possibilities of that historical storytelling, like through one's artistic practice.
So we have this hair wreath, and there is a financial component to this. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, we have a number of hair wreath objects in our collection. We have some really amazing examples of 19th century hair work. In this case, we're looking at an object probably made from the hair of several different people. It might represent a community, it could represent a church or a club or a family. And this hair has been carefully twisted and braided and shaped with wire into this beautiful wreath, which looks almost like a floral wreath, but it's all made out of hair.
Human hair.
Yes, probably human hair. There could be some horsehair in there, but ostensibly it's human hair and some wire and sometimes some little beads. If we look closely, you can see some little shiny beads too in there. But yes, it's a hair wreath, human hair, which some people find a little bit icky. I find fascinating because it's directly connecting us to this community of people who are themselves intertwined in this way, kind of forever in these objects. And this is an object that we could use in lots of different teaching contexts. But one of the most, powerful teaching contexts in which we use this object is in a class on financial coaching that comes every semester. And so every single student who studies financial coaching actually comes to the textile collection and has a session in which they are learning about what people value. Because of course, if you are going to be a wonderful financial coach, the questions that you need to ask help you zoom in on what does this person care about? What matters to them? What goals are we setting? What do they want to spend money on? What do they want to save money for? How do they think about their life? Right? And so objects like this become a prompt for that kind of conversation. What might someone value who saved this? And the students have to think through, well, is it about community? Part of it is about aesthetics. Part of it is about the relationship they might have to these objects. How might we understand what matters to the community that saved this object? And so this is a case where there isn't one right answer, but there's an opportunity for reflection, for conversation, and really thinking deeply about what people value. This object becomes a prompt for doing that. And so we have these classes in which students who are training to be financial coaches come and they spend time looking at a whole range of objects, including this hair wreath. And it invites that kind of reflection and conversation in a very different environment than they're used to. And that kind of reflection really gives them the chance to make new connections and to really think about values in a different way.
Now we assume that this hair wreath was not created for the purpose you just described. We don't know what it was created for.
It's very unlikely it was created to teach financial coaching.
Because I just imagine I don't know if I'd want to encounter the person whose head was large enough to wear that. It seems like it would fit on a giant. It's about a foot and a half across.
Yeah, this was almost certainly a wall decoration. You might also have seen similar seed wreaths, similar size, something you might have over your mantelpiece or on your wall. Sometimes they might be on a table, but I think this probably was meant to be vertical in some way, almost like a giant horseshoe.
Okay, and we have over here a pair of sneakers, and also they look like they are actual sneakers. I'm not sure they could be worn, and then a is that a bag?
Yes.
Tell us about these objects.
Well, this tiny little bag here is remarkable for what it's made out of. So it's actually made out of piña fiber. So that means it's made out of cloth made from pineapples. And so this object is something that has been of interest to students studying botany, and particularly how botany relates to history and culture, which is something that students here at UW study and are interested in. There's a whole group of students who come with their professor every year to engage with objects like this in our collection that don't just, this also displays some plants on it. They're representations of flowers and leaves, but it's also made from a very unusual plant source. In this case, being made from pineapple, and not unusual if you were, excuse me, and not unusual if you were in the Philippines, but unusual here in Wisconsin, right?
Right.
So a wonderful thing for those students to be able to study and learn from. Now, the sneakers here are a relatively recent acquisition to our collection as well, and these were made by the designer, artist, and maker, Johannes Lacour. And these are an example of contemporary streetwear design that he created, these beautiful sneakers. And part of the story of these shoes and part of his story, which he shares very openly, is that he learned about leatherworking. He learned this craft while he was incarcerated. And he really was able to, through his hard work and creativity, transform this craft into a really wonderful and thriving design business. And so this example, these shoes, help us tell that story of contemporary craft and making, but they also provided an opportunity for students in Professor Jen Gaddis's Civil Society and Consumer Studies class to do an oral history with the maker and to learn about how his life experience and story impacted his creative practice. And so that's yet another afterlife that we can think about in this collection, how the objects that we collect and care for can help us understand something about the makers who created them as well. And they become an opportunity for students to help us gather that research and tell those stories as well.
I am very interested in this blouse here. It's from Panama in the from 1930 to 1945. It's an applique and a very rich design in reds and yellows. It's very meticulously handmade traditional blouse, and it's also next to a similar design. But do you want to talk more about this?
Yes. So this pair of objects is a pairing that we often bring out as part of a curriculum that we've developed here on avoiding cultural appropriation. And so this mole blouse is an example of the cultural patrimony of Panama. It is a very important making tradition that's quite important in that nation, particularly to the Guna people, particularly Guna women who make these kinds of objects. The object on the wall behind it is not made by people in Panama. It is an example of quilting fabric that has been printed and sold by an American company.
Sort of a mass production.
Mass production kind of way. We have no evidence that they collaborated in any way with the indigenous people who made this object, that this benefited them in any way. And so together these objects can help us think about sort of some of the nuanced challenges around cultural appropriation and around understanding and honoring the makers of objects and understanding craft techniques and objects like this as part of a community's culture and heritage and future, right? In terms of the economic opportunities an object like this might represent, in terms of the cultural significance an object like this might represent, and how those ideas might be undermined or challenged by something like this mass-produced quilt fabric, which does not honor the original context in which this blouse was created. And so these objects together become prompts for conversation because cultural appropriation is a very complicated topic. It's a very nuanced topic. It's a topic that many people have lots of ideas about, and it's a topic that we need to talk about and try to understand. And this is just a small group of objects. We could do the same exhibit over and over again with the objects that we have in storage and that we take out every day for students on campus. And so this is just a sampling of that work, and it's a joy to be able to share them with you and your listeners and the larger community.
Dr. Carter, thank you so much for this rich, deep explanation of each one of these objects. It's just it's mind-blowing.
Well, thank you. And it's been a real joy to work on this project and to share it with you, because it's such a reminder of these amazing afterlives that these objects have in our collection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.